Welcome, everyone, and great to have you here for the second talk from our Moral Ambition for AI Circle series, where we invite experts working in the field of AI to share their ideas and expertise on how to ensure that AI benefits rather than harms humanity. Today, we are joined by somebody who can truly be called a Renaissance man, in the sense that Adam is both professor of applied computer science and ethics, but also a YouTuber, author of multiple books and publications, and founder of ChangeBase app. So very, very impressive speaker, and he will give us his thoughts on how do we decide between conflicting ethical principles when it comes to AI. And Adam, thank you so much for being here and sharing your expertise. Without further delay, I will share your presentation and pass it on to you.
So much, Karolina, and I appreciate the invitation to chat with you all. I'm also kind of the head of or not the head of it, but I sort of started the Moral Ambition Circle in San Francisco. So the Moral Ambition sort of meetup here. So I'm familiar with moral ambition, and I'm so glad to be talking with fellow moral ambitioners and whoever else joins too. I think some other folks probably are here too, just because they're curious. So awesome, and it's also exciting because I think do we have more of a Eurozone audience? Or is there a particular location where everyone's from, or are we across the world?
I would say across the world, but I can understand that maybe because of the timing, maybe we are a bit skewed towards Europe. But yeah, there's Ohio as well.
Okay, great. We got Ohio and Egypt, so that we got everybody covered. So yeah, and I made my presentation to kind of, because there is actually geographical differences in the trends around AI ethics. So I'll highlight those, and those will come up hopefully in the questions too, because people will have those, they'll represent those geographical differences in our audience, which is great. So yeah, I want to start. So I won't just be like talking at you the whole time. We'll do a little bit of brainstorming, and I'd love to see questions come up, and I'll either answer them right away, or I'll kind of note them, and then as I'm talking, I'll address them, because I know that I'm going to address them later. So yeah, please bring in questions, and we'll start off with a little brainstorm. But first, I'll introduce myself and introduce the topic of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm essentially going to spend a little bit of time, and then I hope we get to questions and more of an open discussion. But I just want to spend a little bit of time sharing with you a working paper that I'm doing right now, which is submitted to the journal AI and Ethics, which is one of the leading AI ethics journals. It's not accepted yet, but it's under review with peer reviewers. I hope it will be accepted. If not, it'll be probably rejected with some revisions. Maybe I'll be able to resubmit it either there or at another journal. But it is a good paper. I've been writing these papers now for 3 years or so, writing ethics papers, and I've gotten pretty good at it. And so I'm happy to share it with you, because it is a pretty good, accurate representation of what's going on. And I hope my proposal, which is this concept of compassionate principlism, or which is a kind of hierarchical principlism, will be at least interesting, if not persuasive to some of you. So we'll talk about creating a more useful AI ethics. So the title of the paper is called "A Proposal for a More Useful AI Ethics, Hierarchical Principlism and the Principle of Compassion." That term, useful AI ethics, is actually a reference to a sort of famous AI ethics paper in the literature right now, which is by a guy named Munn, M-U-N-N, who said that AI ethics is useless, and he's talking about AI principlism, and he says it's useless, and he means it's useless. It's not very useful, is what he means, and he goes into why it is. Anyway, so I'm trying to propose an AI ethics that's a little more useful. The reason he says it's useless is because there are conflicts that emerge between the principles, and then those are irresolvable because the principles are ad hoc. They're just thrown in. You could just sort of make a random list of principles, and then they all can conflict with each other. And so it becomes useless, because people with differing opinions can just kind of camp out in each principle and say, well, you're wrong because my principle is more important. And they can say, no, you're wrong because my principle is more important. And you get this sort of nothing burger from that. So I'm going to propose that there is a way to resolve that using compassion, which is the minimization of suffering. Hello, my name's Adam Braus. I'm in the process of getting a PhD. I'll have it in about a year. I also have 2 master's degrees in cybersecurity and higher educational leadership. I'm a professor of applied computer science. That's like my day job. Most of my research is in philosophy and ethics. I also like to write books and also do, I'm actually working on some translations now. So doing some translating, ancient Greek and French into English, and I'm an entrepreneur. But probably my heart is most in what we're talking about today, which is philosophy and ethics. But, you know, you can't make very much money doing that, as you probably can imagine. So I'm excited to be chatting with you about what is my true love in the world, second to my wife and my child, is philosophy and ethics, which is the study of what is good, what is permissible, what is impermissible, what is obligatory. Like our little agenda for today. So to get some to kind of build up our motivation here, we're going to brainstorm what AI ethical dilemmas matter to you all, and we'll kind of just look at those briefly. And then context, I'll give you a little context. What's the kind of global AI ethics, kind of overview of what's going on in the world in AI ethics. And then we'll talk about a specific problem with a specific theory, which is AI principlism, and that it's useless, as Munn says, because there are conflicts between the principles that are irresolvable. And then we'll talk about, I'll just propose the solution of compassionate principlism, and I'll apply it to three things: misinformation, bias, and automation, which are three common problems or kind of predicted problems with AI. And then we'll have a little Q&A discussion. And I made some conscious robots too. So I'll show you conscious robots at the end if we have time. All right, let's do a quick little brainstorm here. So you can throw it into the chat, or you can, you know, if you want to unmute and say, just shout out or put into the chat, what are the AI ethical dilemmas and issues and problems that are keeping you up at night, or that you think are, what are they for you? This is just to kind of build up our motivation and for me to get some context about, Karima is afraid of AGI. Yes, AGI is dangerous. Okay, impersonation. Yeah, so deep fakes, dangerous deep fakes, bias, non-alignment, right? We could have these AIs running around making paperclip factories. Yep, FM says the existential risk of AI, that AI might kill us all, the Terminator sort of scenario, or squeeze us out as human beings. Yeah, this worry that very few people know what's going on. Yeah, I was trying to communicate this to someone the other day, just like a high school teacher. I was like, we are in deep trouble. And they were like, what do you mean? You know, I was like, yeah, we're in trouble. AGI, automation of jobs. So automation of jobs, technical displacement. We'll talk a little bit about that. Right to explanation, black box nature. AI advances to such a point that humans are not needed. Yep. So AGI just sort of blasts off to the stars without us, takes over the world. Claudio shares this one. Yeah, power concentration. I assume you mean into human hands or AGI hands. There'll be a concentration of power, probably. Ooh, Julio, moral hallucination. That's interesting. Yeah, it makes sense that they hallucinate about facts. Who cares, right? But if they hallucinate about moral things, then that's much more dangerous. Deep fakes that people really believe. AI-driven inequality. Political disempowerment. Yep, that's really good. And I'll highlight too what Karolina says here about AI-driven inequality and economic political disempowerment. That could be two humans, like oligarchs who use AI, or that could be to AI itself. In both cases, it's worrisome. Maybe in some ways it's more worrisome with the humans in charge, but that's definitely bad. Epistemic erosion. AI frontier companies controlling everything. Yep. The trade-off between accuracy, comparison. Yep. Deep learning. Limited public oversight and accountability. Loss of internet kitten prominence. Oh my God, kittens will lose their prominence in the internet. No, kittens must survive. They must be the chief dominant forces of the internet. Cognitive and social decline. And kittens will not lose prominence. They would just be replaced by AI-generated kittens. Okay. Huh. Oh God. Oh God. Thank God. The kittens will survive. Okay. Yeah. So this is great. You guys are throwing out a lot of the things that I consider also major issues with AI and dilemmas that we need to keep our eyes on, and that people need to pay a lot more attention to. And we really need like laws, and we need like czars in charge of these kinds of regulatory things and we don't. And it is a big, scary problem. So we're all, I think, in a similar boat. And I'll talk about 3 of the ones, and I think they came up mostly in the chat. The 3 that I'm going to apply compassionate principlism to are 3 of the major ones that came up here, which is automation. What are these? Automation, misinformation, and bias. And then I think those all kind of add up to that danger and inequality or AGI kind of taking over everything. So let me just say, I think, and I think it's you can argue that, you know, the risks with AI are really twofold. They're not just that you might use AI too much, which is a worry. That's a worry that most of the people, that's where we get most of our fears, right? I think the common fears are we use AI too much and it leads to the error in bad ways or in critically bad ways, and it ends up with these bad outcomes. But I think we have to also recognize, and I think this is more on the side of people who are very, very pro AI and very, you know, AI-philic, and maybe even at the reins of these major companies, is we also don't want to. We want to not use AI too little either. The world has big problems that are very bad, and we want to apply AI right to those things. I like to say that there's a lot of NS in the world, a lot of natural stupidity that needs to be solved, and AI is a good way to do it. You know, or education, which is also good. Education fights natural stupidity as well. But so we want to apply AI to things that are it's good to apply to, but we don't want to overuse it or apply to things that it's bad. So although we like, I think a lot of times when we're critical of AI, we always frame it in terms of overuse or its use in the wrong cases. We have to also accept that if we just killed AI and we didn't have this tool that might be able to do really great things for the world, that would be bad too. So we do want to use AI, but we want to use it in ways that are beneficial, that are good, right? So I'll just start, that's just to kind of lay the groundwork that this isn't going to just be a completely, you know, I'm just completely critical of AI. I'm actually quite AI-philic. I'm very interested in AI and think that it has a lot of good possibilities, but we want to put up the guardrails around it. Just like any technology, you know, fire can burn down your house, but it can also heat your house and save, you know, have people very comfortable, cozy in their house because they have fire. So we want to use it properly. So let me give you a brief kind of overview of the global approaches to AI, which really are just twofold. And then I threw China in there too, because you have to include China because it's huge and awesome. And so essentially in the United States, the dominant AI ethical theory is AI principlism, which is where you have a sort of list of principles, and you know, companies all release their own and ethicists all make their own, and there's a whole bunch, but they kind of coalesce around maybe 5 to 10 principles. And then you know, if you want to know if what you're doing is ethical, you just take out your list of principles and you go down the list and you kind of assess what you're doing with regards to those principles. Maybe the principles are, you know, bias and justice and, you know, human autonomy or, you know, the autonomy of humans, or, you know, whatever it is, beneficence, non-malfeasance. And we'll look more at those in a second. But that's the kind of American, that's what the United States is generally using. And that's what corporations are generally using. So these for-profit corporations, but also well-meaning nonprofits and the foundations and ethicists are using these things as well, right? In Europe and in other Anglo countries like Canada and Australia and you know, New Zealand and such, they're more focused on what would be called a rights-based approach to AI ethics. And so what that does is really a human rights, obviously, human rights-based approach. So what they say is humans have these rights, which are these things that all human beings deserve or should have, and AI should not impinge on those human rights. And if AI can contribute to them, that's even better. So everything comes back to not violating human rights. And generally, you could say, I'll just, as I put in the slide there, I think AI principlism, the danger is AI might be used too much because it's more permissible, because principles can be sort of different and they can have conflicts and they kind of be wide open. And so there's more use of AI and it might be where there's too much. I think the criticism on the European or on the Anglo side, the other Anglo country side, could be that that a rights-based approach might sacrifice long-term or distant or possible improvements to life through AI, because there's an initial impingement as maybe we sort out or we experiment with AI. There might be some risks to some human rights, and so they shut off the whole research. And that's the criticism, is that a rights-based approach will be too limiting, and you'll use AI too much, too little. Okay, so this is sort of the ground. This is the very simplified discussion that's basically in the literature right now and in the world. AI principlism, too much; rights-based, too little. And then I put in there China, which uses socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's the name of China's economic system. And as far as I can tell, which is just from reading the news and reading about things that go on in China with AI, is that AI is subordinate to the CCP, and they are using AI in precisely the way they would use any other capital infrastructure, whether it was electric cars or a bridge or a big dam or something. It's subordinated to socialism with Chinese characteristics, which has sort of a nationalistic economic development goal. So their goal isn't as open-ended, I think, to principlism or as closed to enhancing human rights, but it's more directed towards Chinese nationalism, the advancement of the Chinese economy and the Chinese people. So that seems to be the three main. People don't usually bring up the China one, but I think it's important because China's a major player in AI. So looking at what they are using it for is actually quite important, and it seems to be somewhat neglected in the Western discourse, which is really foolish, because they might even pull ahead of America at some point, potentially, with AI, and we should really keep our eye on their way of thinking about that. So in terms of this presentation, I want to talk about AI principlism. So I'm in America, for good or bad, I'm in America. So we're going to talk about AI principlism and maybe how we might be able to constrain AI principlism a little bit more so that it ends up more in the sweet spot, a sweet spot of not too much AI and not too little, and not in the wrong places, but in the right places, right? Not in the wrong applications, but in the right applications. And, there maybe are two ways to do this, right? You could take a rights-based approach and loosen a rights-based approach a little bit, right? So then it could be a little looser, but rights-based approaches don't really allow for loosening, because rights are very rigid. You have unalienable human rights that come from nature, and or they have some moral strength behind them, based on whatever argument you make for them, and they're pretty rigid. And so it's hard to say, well, we're going to loosen human rights. Like, people in human rights conversations don't like to hear about human rights loosening for some end, right? They want to just hear about human rights being rigid and being policed and being, supported. So, but principlism, because it's so loose, it actually could be constrained a little, and that would actually be acceptable. I mean, the overarching idea of ethical principles is to constrain just doing anything, right? So what if we could constrain ethical principlism a little more in a way that people would agree with? So let's look at the main principles. So in the traditional principles of ethical principlism came from bioethics. So ever since the Nuremberg trials, and then after the Nuremberg trials, there was the Nuremberg Code, and the Nuremberg Code then was updated into the what was it called? The Mayfield Report? No, what was it called? Well, anyways, I can't remember the name. I won't Google it in front of you. But there was a report that came out after that in the late 50s and the early 60s that really codified even more and took into account various problems that emerged between the Nuremberg trials and that time. And that report was then codified by two ethicists named Childress and Beauchamp and Childress, who are the kind of god kings of ethics, of bioethics. And they have this textbook that's in its 9th edition that's called bioethical whatever, and it's bioethical principles or something. And they're god kings. Bioethics uses these principles. That's what it does. That's the leading theory of bioethics across the world, is the bioethical principlism. So when AI ethicists were like, let's find out how to do AI ethics, they pretty much just cribbed directly from bioethics. They just were like, hey, we're going to take bioethics, we're going to apply it to AI ethics. And that means they took principlism. Okay. And the four main principles of principlism are these: beneficence, autonomy, justice, and non-maleficence, non-maleficence. And that just means beneficence is doing as much good as you can. Autonomy is preserving the autonomy of like a patient in bioethics, right? Or human beings in an AI ethical environment. Justice, fairness towards all the parties involved in whatever issue. And then non-maleficence, not deliberately doing evil, maybe for gain, maybe for your own gain or for, some nationalistic purposes or whatever. So these four principles are the key ones. Now, AI ethicists add many more. So they might add bias, privacy, alignment, trustworthiness of the AI. They might add all these other principles, and that's fine because principlism allows for many principles. It's fine. There's no limit necessarily on principles. You can have as many as you want. But the problem with bioethical principlism, and then therefore also with AI ethical principlism, because they're just cribbing from bioethical principlism, is conflicts. So there might be conflicts between the principles, and the bioethical principles are aware of this. They're aware that there can be conflicts, and they don't really fight it too hard. They're like, yes, there are conflicts. We have a way. They have a way to kind of resolve the conflicts a little bit, but they are kind of open to there being kind of standing conflicts because they want to embrace ethical pluralism. So bioethicists want to embrace ethical pluralism to say, well, at some point, two people who are both well-meaning and well-informed might just disagree. And that, we don't want that to be all the time, but when it comes down to brass tacks, at some point people might disagree. And so they're kind of okay with there being some conflicts. They say that there's a way to minimize those conflicts, and it's like a 4-step process. We don't have to go into that, but they say that. So that's sort of the discussion on the bioethical principlism side. Here's these great principles. They are very good. You should, when you're doing a scientific study, like a bioethical study, you should review these principles. And then if there's some conflicts, there's this way to resolve them, but there won't be very many conflicts, we promise, if usually. And so this is a good theory. And it's dominated bioethics. This is the dominant theory of bioethics. So the AI ethicists took this, but the AI ethicists have exploded the number of principles. There are hundreds of different standards, each with dozens of different principles. There's hundreds, almost thousands there's many in the high hundreds of principles. And those have been, to some extent, boiled back down to these same four. But that's just a kind of simplification. The reality is there's so many different principles. And so the criticism is that using principles when there's this explosion of them and when there's conflicts between them is that they are useless. It's essentially a kind of moral relativism. You can just make up whatever principles you want for your company, and then your company can say we're advancing those ethical principles, therefore we're ethical. But actually the principles you chose could be totally, awful to someone else's view. And then you could say, well, we're following our ethical principles. It becomes a kind of moral relativism. So they're meaningless. This is what Munn said here. Luke Munn said they're meaningless because they're contested, incoherent, and it makes them difficult to apply. They're isolated because they're situated in industry and education systems which are largely ignored ethics, and then that largely ignore ethics. So even if you make these principles, the engineers on the ground just ignore it, or the students ignore it, or the teachers ignore it. So they're isolated, and they're toothless. They lack any consequences and adhere to corporate agendas. So this is Munn's criticism of AI and AI principles. And I think it's an accurate representation. If we look around at these foundational companies or all the startups, I'm in San Francisco here, and there's AI startups on every street corner. All these guys and gals have, ethical principles that they claim to be following, but then really are just following pretty much their own selfish agenda to get as much money as they possibly can. That's what they're doing. And so I think this is a really good assessment of the problems with AI ethical principles. Maybe we should adopt a rights-based approach. Maybe we should adopt a European rights-based approach, but the criticism there would be then that would limit the research too much. That would limit the experimentation with what we could do with AI too much. And so we're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. But maybe we can fix that. So let me just highlight that these conflicts will emerge, and they necessarily will emerge because the ethical principles are ad hoc, right? Ad hoc, just Latin for all thrown into a bucket at random. Like, it just means that people are just picking off the shelves ethical principles. They're not systematized. They're not a coherent system where they're all where no conflicts would emerge. They're just a bunch of kind of things thrown in a bucket together. So here's an example. Should we use AI ethics to make businesses more automated? That would be beneficence, right? Doing the most good we could, but that would cause then technological displacement. Well, that's maleficence. Well, now we have a conflict between beneficence and non-malfeasance, the two major principles. Or should we make policing more efficient, right? That increases justice. I mean, if the policing is done well, ostensibly that would increase justice for human beings, but it would curtail privacy, which is a loss of autonomy. So now we have justice and autonomy in conflict, right? How do you decide which one? Because you have these two conflicts that are co-equal and they conflict. Or here's another example: you can make a government more effective, beneficence, right? That does more good for the world if government is effective, but you cede more control to AI systems because you're making the government more AI automated. Well, that's a loss of autonomy. So now again, we have beneficence and autonomy in conflict. How do you decide? If you think those are co-equal, you can't decide from the principles. You have to bring in your own biases, or you have to bring in your own moral decisions of what you think is more important. And Americans might generally think beneficence is more important. Europeans, more rights-based approach people, might think the loss of autonomy, the loss of or the malfeasance is worse. And so there's a kind of, they end up having difference of opinion, but the principles can't solve the problem on their own. Okay. I want to see these questions too. Okay, we'll come to these questions at the end. These are good questions, though. Okay, so I'll just share my solution, which is to add an arbitrating principle, a hierarchical principle, a principle above the common principles, which is the principle of compassion. And that may sound like I'm like, I don't know, some kind of cuddly bear, I don't know, some kind of like kumbaya, hold hands, guy, but that's actually not, it's not, I don't mean compassion in the way I think some people understand it. I mean it I'm a philosopher, so I mean it in a very specific sense. I don't mean like warm feelings or like taking care of a baby or something. That's not what I mean. I mean compassion in a very strict sense, which is doing what leads to the least suffering. Okay, so that might be taking care of a baby, right? Because it maybe taking care of a baby leads to the least suffering in that situation. But it's also like the lifeguard who swims out to you, and you're like flailing because you're drowning, and the lifeguard has to like deck you in the face to get you to chill so he can like rescue you, right? Like doing compassionate things doesn't have to be just soft, cozy things. It can also be very deliberate, very difficult, even violent things. But it's the thing, you're taking that action that leads to the least avoidable suffering. So just to kind of clarify, when I say compassion, we don't want to drift off into this sort of kumbaya land. We want to think really seriously. Sometimes being caring and concerned, that is the way to lead to the least avoidable suffering. But sometimes doing something really deliberately and really strictly is the way to lead to the least avoidable suffering. So the proposal is to have this additional principle, which is minimizing avoidable suffering. So here's that definition put a little bit more formulaically. So the principle of compassion is defined here as morally asymmetrical consequentialism. So consequentialism, that's the judging of something as good or evil based on the outcomes of the action. So is this action good or evil? Well, what consequences does it lead to? Does it lead to good consequences, pleasure and happiness, or does it lead to bad consequences, suffering and pain? So most forms of consequentialism, like utilitarianism, which is the classic, most common form of consequentialism, is morally symmetrical. Okay, so that means you can trade the suffering of some for the happiness of others. So long as the happiness is greater than the suffering, you can trade those. Okay, that's utilitarianism. That's and almost all forms of consequentialism are morally symmetrical. They treat happiness and suffering as a number line, where suffering is on one end and happiness on the other. And as long as you move this direction on the number line, towards happiness, you can trade the suffering of some for the greater happiness of others, right? A little bit of suffering for some, but great happiness for others is acceptable, because it's all about moving kind of on the number line towards happiness. That's classic utilitarianism. That's almost all forms of consequentialism. I'm proposing this principle of compassion is a morally asymmetrical form of consequentialism. You cannot trade the suffering of some for the happiness of others. Suffering and happiness are on two different lines that are not they're not the same and interchangeable across. They're morally different. To suffer is morally different than to be happy. And to suffer is much worse morally, right? But it's totally different. You can't trade between them. So that means that no matter how much happiness is at stake, if there's any suffering created, then you can't do it. This is what I'm describing. And this has various problems, and people discuss and say you can't do that for these reasons. But I'm proposing that you can and you should, and that there's a way to think about it so that this is the way we should judge between conflicts between principles. This might seem very simple to many people, which is like, if you have a conflict between two principles, just pick the choice that leads to less suffering. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying the tiebreaker is, when you have a conflict between principles, just pick the option that has less suffering. That's what I'm proposing, which is pretty obvious, right? So here's the exact decision procedure that you follow to do this. So this is precisely what you do. You sum the total potential suffering, then you sum the total potential happiness, then you compare the potential suffering. You choose the less suffering. If suffering is equal, then you can choose the happier of the two. This is how you'd use morally asymmetrical consequentialism. Okay, just to be really clear of what I'm proposing. One thing too that can throw people off is I'm not talking about empathy. So some people can equate compassion and empathy, but actually they're actually different. When you really get them clear what they are, they're different. So compassion is minimizing suffering. Empathy is simulating another person's experience in your own experience. So those are very different things, but they're often equated because we use compassion when we're trying to minimize someone's suffering. We use empathy to see what their experience might be, and then we try to take action. So they're very closely related in terms of how our operation to be compassionate, but they're separate in terms of what they actually are fundamentally. So we don't have to get necessarily too into that, although I'm happy to talk more about the difference between empathy and compassion. But just so we keep in mind, compassion is really just minimizing suffering. You don't have to empathize with people at all if you don't want to, as long as you want to minimize suffering. For example, there are psychopaths who are surgeons, and they're fantastic surgeons, but they're psychopaths. And they don't actually empathize with their patients, but they do want to cure their patients and do good surgeries and save their lives. So that's an example of someone who's not compassionate, but who is not empathetic, but is deeply compassionate. Usually they go together, though. Usually you think someone who's very compassionate is going to be very empathetic too. So there are some limitations to this. As a good philosopher, you always have to throw out the limitations that are out there. It's difficult to measure suffering, and it's difficult to compare suffering between people and between other entities, right? An animal can suffer, a person can suffer. Some people even argue that groups of people can suffer. And how to compare and measure those is difficult, and I agree with that, and I agree that it's difficult to do that, and maybe a challenging problem epistemically. It's also hard to predict things about the future, and so all of this is about predicting what the outcomes of an action will be, and that's hard to do. So you might screw up, or someone might screw up using this, agreeing on who suffers and how much. So some people might think they're not suffering, they are suffering. An animal can't suffer, or they can only suffer less than a human. Other people say, no, the animal can suffer as much as I can, right? There's this conflict about who can suffer and how much. I agree that that's an open question and a difficult thing. And then obviously not everyone will agree to use this principle of compassion. And so they'll use some other ethical standard, and so then there'll be disagreement between those people. So those are some limitations to keep in mind. And okay, so I'll just quickly say misinformation. I'll just say there are benefits and there are sufferings, right? So benefits, happiness above contentedness, suffering, sources of grave suffering. I would just say the conclusion, the principle of compassion would say that generative AI tools for synthetic content should be forbidden outright or deeply regulated, because the suffering is way greater. There's a huge chance for suffering, and the benefit is just convenience and amusement, which are, who cares, right? So the suffering would way outweigh, and so we should just, there should be like laws immediately against all kinds of this kind of slop and generative AI stuff. Bias and discrimination is obviously bad. It leads to suffering. AI systems can have that kind of bias. We're going to get to you, Claudio. That's the next slide. So the solution that principle of compassion would offer for bias and discrimination is basically, if you're going to replace any human system with an AI system, you would just have to assess two things to know if it was allowed to do it, which is that AI system going to be less biased than a human system already is, because human systems are already biased. So the AI system has to be less biased. And is there a credible improvement plan, right? Because is the AI going to get less and less bias over time because there's a credible improvement plan to make it less biased? Humans maybe will get a little less bias over time, maybe through education or through improvement, but it may get worse, So if an AI system is both less biased than humans are now, and there's a credible system, a credible plan to make them even less biased, then that system can replace the human system. That's my argument from the principle of compassion, because that would be what would reduce avoidable suffering the most. And so that would be, so that you could put a system in place for like bail recommendations, right? For prison, for criminals, bail recommendation. If you could prove that the bail system today that you were about to put in was less biased than the current human system, and it has a credible plan to get even less bias over time. So it doesn't matter that it has bias, it just has to be less than humans and be getting even less bias. And then automation and displacement, to Claudio's question, what about like time saving or labor saving? So this would just divide this into two categories, right? There's automation that's purely for profit, right? Purely for increasing some people's profit, right? And then there's AI automation that eliminates dangerous and unwanted work and does useful work that no one is prepared to do, right? For example, understaffed healthcare systems. Africa needs 800,000 doctors, right? It'd be great if we could just send AI doctors to help Africa be healthier, right? You're not displacing any doctors by doing that, right? So that would divide it up into those two categories. So you would be not permissible if it was just, we're just automating this factory so that the stockholders can make more money. That would be impermissible. But if you were saying, well, we're going to use this AI system to, do maintenance on a nuclear reactor, which no one can do because it would be radiation if you went in and did it, that would be totally permissible, because that's reduces suffering. So it always comes back to, do you reduce suffering or increase it whenever there's a conflict between those principles? Cool. So that's it. Sorry it took so long. I was hoping to go a little faster, but now we can do a little Q&A and a little discussion.